So today I figured we'd talk about the Moonies. Who are they? When were they at their prime? Why are they relevant? There's a really interesting story behind these guys. To start, I'm sure you all know of the BITE model. Behavior control, information control, thought control, emotion control. It's the model we use to determine if something is a cult or not. That model was created by Stephen Hassan and is updated by him from time to time. Stephen Hassan was a member of the Moonies back in the 70s. That's what got him motivated to become the cult expert that he is today. He tells his story of being a Moonie in his book, Combating Cult Mind Control. So I feel like it's about time I pay my respects by covering the cult of which he was a member for so long. First, I'm going to talk about the leader, then I'll talk about their beliefs and their core tenets. Let's get into it. So what are the Moonies? First of all, I feel like I should mention that they don't like being called Moonies. They accepted the term up until 1984, but as of that year, they take it as a pejorative. They even used to have t-shirts that said, "I'm a Moonie and I love it." I find that interesting. When I was Jehovah's Witness, I used to consider being called a JW a pejorative, but they seem to have embraced that term at this point with their website. Either way, the Moonies are called the Moonies because of their ex-leader, Sun Myung Moon. Sun Myung Moon. That's an interesting name if I've ever heard it. But don't get too excited. It's fake. As with most cult leaders, this guy came up with a new name for himself. He was South Korean, and he was originally born Mun Yong Myong in 1920. I'm 95% sure I pronounced that wrong, but it's fine. At this point, I'm pretty sure he isn't divine or in direct communication with Jesus or something, so I'm not that concerned about offending him. Like I was saying, around 1984, their perception of the name Moonie started to shift, and they began to think it was super derogatory. So only ex-members really continued to use it. Stephen Hassan still uses it, presumably because he left before they started to view it as derogatory. Anyways, back to what I was saying. Moon's parents converted from Confucianism to Christianity around 1930, when he was about 10. In 1935, Jesus supposedly appeared to him and asked him to finish the work he'd started before his crucifixion. According to Moon, he considered and prayed about it, and ultimately decided to do it, and eventually changed his name to Sun Myung Moon. In 1943, he married his first wife, and coincidentally, that's the same year his second wife was born. I'm fairly certain that breaks the classic age gap rule. If somebody's younger than half your age plus 7 years, then they're too young for you. I don't know if you guys have heard this before, but I heard it at work a while back, and I thought it was kind of interesting. If you're, say, 35, you can be with somebody who's half your age, which is about 17, plus 7 years, for a total of 24 years old. Any younger and you're robbing the cradle. Probably avoid doing that. He ended up divorcing his first wife in 1953 and getting married to a younger one in 1960. She just turned 17 and he was 40. They had a ceremony called the Holy Marriage. But let's rewind a little bit. Back to 1945. That's around the time World War II ended, and Japan lost control of Korea. Being from Korea, that's around the time he started preaching. In 1954, he founded the HSA-UWC in Seoul, Korea. HSA-UWC stands for Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. And technically this religion is called the Unification Church, not the Moonies. So that started in 1945, and in 1957 he came up with the Divine Principle, which is kind of the foundation for the entire church. We'll get into it. In 1958 and 1959 he started sending out missionaries to the US and Japan, which puts us back where he married his second wife in 1960. So apparently he and his second wife had 14 children. Which is so many kids. God! There are rumors that he had another kid in 1954. It's unverified, but if you remember, he divorced his first wife in 1953, so we have no idea who or where that other kid is. All we know for sure is that he had 14 with his second wife, who was known as True Mother. He was known as True Father. The children were called True Children, and their family was known as, wait for it, True Family. A year after marrying his second wife, he came up with a rededication ceremony for marriages or engagements called the Blessing. The first ceremony included 36 couples from the church. 12 couples were already married before coming to the church. The other 24 couples were forced together by Moon. He said he was matching them, what basically amounts to forced planned marriage. Eventually, the guy moved to the US because he seemed to have a swell of support there. Japan's more secular than the US, so his mission trips weren't as successful. In 1974, he told his members to support Nixon during the Watergate scandal, which is when things started getting really political. Nixon publicly thanked Moon and his members for the support, which gave the Moonies even more publicity. He gave public speeches across the US, including but not limited to one in Madison Square Garden Garden and 2 in Yankee Stadium in New York City. He also did a speech at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. to 300,000 people. I went to D.C. for the Reason Rally a couple years ago, and it was so awesome. I'd love to go back to D.C. That was an awesome trip. The very next Reason Rally they have, I'm going. So if you guys want to meet me in person, then plan for that. I think they do it every 4 years on an election year, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Last one was 2016. Just keep a lookout. Anyways, sorry, I got sidetracked there. As I was saying, in 1975, Moon founded the Unification Theological Seminary to train church leadership in the divine principle and how to lead churches. I mentioned the divine principle earlier, but I didn't really get into detail about what it was. Basically, a big old list of core tenets. I'm going to address those in a minute, just bear with me on that. So in 1976, about a year after Moon set up the seminary school, he started getting some real criticism from the American Jewish Committee. They published a report about the divine principle, saying it contained, quote, pejorative language, stereotyped imagery, and accusations of collective sin and guilt. The church denied it all at first, but eventually some of the church leaders came forward and, quote, expressed regret. Said some members misunderstood Judaism and wanted to form better relations with the Jewish community. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't excuse their thinly veiled hatred for anybody, but at least a few of them admitted to it and tried to fix it. So in 1982, Moon was convicted of filing false income tax returns. A ton of people protested his arrest, including but not limited to Jerry Falwell, as a persecution of religious liberty, of course. He ended up serving 13 months in prison. Those are the most important parts of Moon's life and involvement in the church. In 2008, he appointed his youngest son, Hyung Jin Moon, as the new leader of the church. He was pretty active later in life, but it mostly involved travel and posturing, like crowning himself with the crown of peace in a Senate office building in Washington, D.C. If a senator had done the crowning, or if the president had done it or something, it would have been a different story. But any old asshole can walk in and crown themselves anything they want. So it doesn't really make any sense to me why he would even bother. Kind of an embarrassment. Anyways, he eventually died on September 2nd, 2012. And that's the history of the founder of the Unification Church, aka the Moonies. Now let's talk about the divine principle. It's basically a big list of their core beliefs and tenets written by Sun Myung Moon. They believe humans are meant to be the center of harmony for the universe. The best way to get close to that harmony is by getting married. Hence all the blessing ceremonies they went through. Basically what amounts to group marriages. They didn't believe God sent people to hell. They believed that people chose to go to hell, but in a very strange way. They think that when you do something bad, it creates, and I'm quoting here, it creates God love poison. So when you breathe it after you die, it's agonizing. So sinners freely choose to go to hell instead of breathing in the poisoned God love air. I'm gonna take that as extremely loaded language. Usually with loaded language, it has some kind of basic meaning outside the church too. Like with Jehovah's Witnesses, when they say something like worldly people, others know what they mean by that, even if they haven't been on the inside of the church. It does mean something more to Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's what makes it loaded language. But all this talk of God love air isn't just loaded, it's also ambiguous for the outsider. Anyways, they also believe that since Jesus died on the cross and didn't complete his mission of creating his heaven on earth, there aren't any perfect spirits to go to heaven, so it's just empty. They also had really strong political views, a lot like Jonestown in that way. Jonestown was a super communist group, and the Moonies were a super democratic group, so they felt like democracy is the solution to everything. They felt like as humanity matures, real democratic countries will become more and more Christian. Eventually Jesus will come back and start the kingdom of heaven on earth like he was supposed to the first time until he f***ed up and got murdered by some dude. But they believe that democracy was created to undermine satanic monopolies of power. I find that fascinating because they're in favor of God's kingdom taking over and Jesus starting the kingdom of heaven on earth. That's a monarchy at the very least, not a democracy. And actually that's a theocracy because they want an eternal dictatorship run by God with no checks or balances. That's the very antithesis of democracy. So I'm really not sure why they talk so well about democracy when the Bible fully endorses a dictatorship like that. Maybe they weren't connecting the dots, that that's actually what the Bible was endorsing. They also believe that all people should learn a single language. We only have the chaos of different languages because we exalted the will of Satan with the Tower of Babel. More loaded language. Exalted the will of Satan. And what language should we all speak? Quote, if Christ does indeed return to the land of Korea, then Korean will certainly become the mother tongue for all humanity. They think dictatorships and communism are the worst things on the face of the earth. That's fascinating, isn't it? Around that time, the US was pushing out pro-democracy, anti-communism propaganda, and in comes a cult who, in a striking coincidence, holds the exact same political views. It couldn't possibly be because they were being influenced by the public discourse in their area at the time, and because they wanted to gain the favor of powerful people in that area. Anyways, a few key examples they cited as communist were Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and the leaders of Japan's militaristic government, but the Kims of North Korea were conspicuously unmentioned. We've got an interesting quote here from the Divine Principle. What form does this final war between democracy and communism take? It is primarily a war of ideologies. Indeed, this war will never truly cease unless a truth emerges which can completely overthrow the ideology of Marxism-Leninism that is threatening the modern world. Communist ideology negates religion and promotes the exclusive supremacy of science. Hence, the new truth which can reconcile religion and science will emerge and prevail over the communist ideology. It will bring about the unification of the communist and democratic worlds." End quote. I imagine he's probably trying to get on people's good sides by talking about all that stuff. I can't imagine a case in which it would be beneficial for him to endorse democracy so much. I mean, most churches just leave it out of their belief system completely. He didn't have to make it political. I really think he was just trying to rally support from people in high places. Here's another quote from the Divine Principle. "With the fullness of time, God has sent one person to this earth to resolve the fundamental problems of human life and the universe. His name is Sun Myung Moon. For several decades, he wandered through the spirit world so vast as to be beyond imagining. He trod a bloody path of suffering in search of the truth, passing through tribulations that God alone remembers. Since he understood that no one can find the ultimate truth to save humanity without first passing through the bitterest of trials, he fought alone against millions of devils, both in the spiritual and physical worlds, and triumphed over them all. Through intimate spiritual communion with God and by meeting Jesus and many saints in paradise, he brought to light all the secrets of heaven." Dude's a little grandiose, isn't he? He seems to think a lot of himself. Anyways, it was definitely a cult. They did harmful stuff to people, like they'd force people to shun their families. They controlled clothing and hairstyle. They had loaded language and thought-stopping techniques to prevent homesickness, and they'd lie to people to get them to join. It was destructive and harmful, and it scarred Stephen Hassan, much like many of us have been scarred. That's what drove him to go on to write his book about the Moonies and invent the bite model. So ultimately, he used his knowledge for a very good purpose. Good for him. I'm glad we have him fighting alongside the rest of us against destructive cults like this one. Okay, that's all I've got for you. Join my Discord, check me out on Patreon and Facebook, and check out the secret link of the day. Oh, and check out my podcast and my science channel. I talk to fans on the podcast all the time. And on the science channel, I usually try to address common misconceptions perpetuated by Christians, like misconceptions about evolution, the Big Bang, that kind of thing. Anyways, check all that stuff out. All the links are in the description. Thanks for watching, guys.